Now, the last paper is, of course, Naomi Rouse, and the question is she going to help us get the papers right by introducing this notion of dignity? And I mean, whenever I think of dignity, I know this sounds just terrible, and I hope you will forgive me, but the first thing I think about is that wonderful scene at the beginning of Singing in the Rain, right? Where you get Gene Kelly talking about, well, we do this with dignity, and then you see all the peep shows and stuff that he's playing out there in this case. And so you have this constant contrast between the way in which he self-promotes on the one hand and the rather grim reality that he has on the other. That's the way I tend to think of dignity in terms of a legal argument. That is, what happens is it always sort of sounds itself to be far more lofty than it turns out to be, and that in fact it has a same problem that Jason and Jonathan have with respect to each other, which is that it's eternally inconsistent in ways that I find somewhat troubling and uneasy. And one of the things about Naomi, and this is, I mean, it's probably nice, but there's a kind of a real difficulty here. You are being extremely reasonable and thoughtful and fair-minded and balanced in this particular case. You spend most of your time doing typological and distinction. It's a paper that's written in the ordinary language philosophy of 1960 rather than in the moral indignation philosophy of 1980, of which I am, of course, one of the leading exponents, for better or for worse. And this is why I like indignation as opposed to dignity in these cases, is because if you actually look at the way in which the papers cohere one to another, their internal, I'll be done, believe me, you get real internal kinds of difficulties in the sense that the contrast, all of these situations, sometimes they line up, at which case one is redundant, and sometimes they're in conflict, at which point you can't figure out what it is that you're supposed to do. And so, you know, I mean, I happen to think that the minimum wage laws are a bad thing, and I think it's really a terrible affront to the dignity of individuals so that they're unable to decide for themselves whether this particular grubby job is worth it, because we have some state legislature who thinks that the only compensation that you get is a wage, whereas I'm smart enough to realize that the training, the opportunities, the connections, and the habit building, what really matters with respect to this introductory level picture, and I have to let these low-level morons sitting there in Washington who are doing this solely because there's a union that doesn't want upstart non-union competition, particularly from young men and women who happen to come from overseas, foreigners and so forth and the like. And I think it's just terribly indignant. And then you get somebody else who says, I just think it's absolutely terrible that somebody should have to shovel garbage out of a toilet for $2 an hour, and it's just undignified to do so. If you have a concept which in effect leads in every case to equal and opposite results, then you're getting in trouble. So this is what I think that we ought to do. And I think basically you agree with this, and I think you have to state it at some point, I mean, which is that you do believe in dignity in the first place, in the Kantian sense, that is presumptively every person is entitled to the respect. Not that other people are going to think you're a great guy or a great gal, but that essentially by virtue of being a person, I just can't walk all over your face, right? And so we're all got places in the social utility function, and you can't just simply diminish me in order to improve anybody else. And one of the great failings of modern moral philosophy is every Kantian insists that he's a non-utilitarian, whereas when you actually look at their formulations, they are all Parisian liberals, and they just don't know how to acknowledge it. And, you know, so once you get that there, that's the first point. Okay. Then the second point is about, you know, the respect stuff. Well, frankly, my dear, I respect the rights of people even if they're worthless, but I don't respect people even if they're worthless. And that to me, the autonomy of judgment means that I'm entitled to decide whether or not the conduct of other people is worthy of respect, and the state ought not to tell me exactly what it is that they ought to do. And at this particular point, if you put these things together, it turns out that you get the Aristotelian and the Kantian in the following way. On a libertarian world, which this basically becomes, that's what sets the rights of one individual against another, and then all the moral judgments come in into telling you how it is that you exercise your particular freedoms one way or another. So if you put all of these things together, it seems to me that you can actually have a normative position and just end it up. And when the labor guys come in and say, you know, collective bargaining is found in the Bible as one of these things for which we all have to respect, you can stick your nose at them and say, there's nothing about state monopolies which is worthy of even any kind of respect, dignified or others. But anyhow, look, the fact that I feel so happily excited about all these papers is, I think, the finest warrant of their general excellence. So thank you. I'll go sit down and you ask them the questions.
better to take questions.
Great. I was going to say you each have a minute, which is not really much, so then we'll just open it up to questions. So just hands raised, happy to engage anyone in the conversation. Any questions? If not, we are going to revert to their comments, and they're going to have 90 seconds. It's going to be like a little marathon to watch them each have to respond to the comments. So, questions?
John,
Gene.
you got John McGinnis in the back.
Yes, this question is to Jonathan Mitchell. I must say I'm a little confused about the costs and benefits of this policy. I mean, there are other ways that the Supreme Court can evade issues, right? It can not take the case. It can say it was granted improperly. What's the advantage of going down this route, given that there seems to be real cost to state autonomy? You're deciding something on the issue of state law. Maybe the court's making all these terrible decisions. That's true. But isn't that another axis of state competition that we don't want actually the federal government to interfere with? And the Supreme Court's part of the federal government. They're making bad decisions about what public accommodation are in New Jersey. That's for the people of New Jersey to try to settle in our system of competitive federalism. And the court has other ways of, if they don't want to get in this, not to do it. On the other hand, if they do want to do it, all they're going to have to do is take another case finally to make the same constitutional decision. So I'm a little lost, frankly, ultimately, about what the advantage of your approach is.
Well, this is a second best proposal. It's designed for the Supreme Court that we actually have, rather than a different Supreme Court that might always interpret the Constitution correctly, or a different Supreme Court that might practice the virtues of judicial minimalism or the passive virtues. I'm proposing this on the assumption that the Supreme Court will continue to intervene to reverse state Supreme Court decisions that it dislikes. And Bush against Gore is a good example of that. Boy Scouts against Dale is another. I mean, perhaps in a first best world, we could just get new justices appointed who would be more inclined to deny certiorari in these situations. But given that that doesn't seem likely to happen anytime soon, and given that the Supreme Court has been doing this for many decades, this prerogative to reverse on state law, I think, would at least be some safety valve to minimize the hydraulic pressure that the current Murdoch regime is placing on federal constitutional doctrine.
How do you reconcile your argument with Erie?
It's consistent with Erie because Erie prohibits federal courts from displacing state law with general federal common law. Supreme Court appellate jurisdiction over state Supreme Court rulings are reviewing the state court's application of state law, and the Supreme Court is enforcing and interpreting state law rather than replacing it with some federal general common law. Well, I bracket that issue in the paper.
Can I just ask a quick question of Jonathan, just to follow up? You talk about state law. Would you allow the Supreme Court to do this when the state law issue is a state constitutional law issue? I mean, that would actually suggest a kind of parity between what you're doing and what I'm doing, rather than us being so different.
Yeah, they have the power to review issues of state law so long as the case presents a federal claim. The question is, when should they grant writs of certiorari in these situations to review state Supreme Court interpretations of state law? That's a prudential policy question, not a question of their legal power or authority. And my argument right now is limited to situations in which the state law reversal could enable them to avoid a difficult federal constitutional pronouncement. It's possible that could come up when a state Supreme Court misinterprets its state constitution and thereby creates a possible contentious federal constitutional question for the justices to consider. So yes.
We have a few questions in time, so to get to the audience.